All right, guys. In the last reading of Dr. Chazan's World Prehistory and Archaeology with the subtitle Pathways Through Time, again, this is the fourth edition, and it came out in 2018. A little outdated, but still pretty far in terms of the archaeological record and in terms of material culture. We were talking about defining social complexity in the last video, which was 30 minutes long. When I was on the Atlantic coast. Just getting back from across the Atlantic in the old world of Europe, now we're talking about complexity without the state. So we're talking about stateless societies. And of course, some of the most impressive archaeological sites in the world were produced by societies that described as either ranked or stratified, and of course, some other would describe as chiefdoms. Of course, after this video, we will understand the development of Stonehenge, for example, over there in the old world, and the social and economic context that surrounds the construction of that monument. We will also go over the evidence for the function and political organization of the Pueblo Bonito as well, and the current theories of the origination of the Society of Great Zimbabwe. We'll also talk about the function and political organization of Cahokia. And, of course, we're talking about Stonehenge. That's over there in the British Isles, Great Zimbabwe's around the southern tip, southern tip, but more towards the east in Africa. And, of course, Cahokia is over there, and I would say like the middle eastern part of the United States. And Chaco Canyon, which is over there towards the western part of the United States. Easter Island, for example, is a speck of land thousands of miles away from any other inhabited island. The monumental stone heads known as moai that dot the island embody the enigma that is the heart of this understanding in this lecture. Easter Island has never had large cities, and it has never even had large populations. And so the island has no particular material wealth, and its inhabitants were not in contact with any of its neighbors until the Europeans reached there in the year 1722. Again, we're talking about the early 18th century. And so we might ask the question, how, and perhaps more pertinently, why did the people of Easter Island construct these massive monuments? Again, just look up the moai statues on Easter Island. What motivated them to quarry the rock laboriously, drag those massive stones across the entire island, and then set them up on elaborate platforms? Archaeological research on Easter Island has gone a long way toward providing an answer to these very complexing questions. Of course, competing leaders erected the moai during the periods of prosperity. Competition between chiefs fueled a cycle of construction of monuments, and some archaeologists have argued that in the fragile island ecology of Easter Island, this competitive cycle had disastrous consequences. It resulted in deforestation and the decimation of resources. During the subsequent period of ecological distress, the construction of moai ceased and appears to have been replaced by increased levels of violence. And again, this is by Flindley and Bond in 2003. Societies that have developed to a degree political complexity, but that lack a fully developed state bureaucracy. Remember, we talked about how bureaucracy is one of the key top 10 distinguishing definitions of what makes up a city as opposed to that of a village or a town. They often produce archaeological sites that strike us as enigmatic or even mysterious in nature. These sites are frequently characterized by elaborate and well-planned construction, but yet yield little evidence of a ruling elite class. And in this reading, we will examine the archaeological record of Stonehenge, Chaco Canyon, Cahokia, and Great Zimbabwe. All of these cities are the ruins of structures built by societies that would define as ranked or stratified, and also could or would be described as chiefdoms. Of course, none have produced evidence of the centralized bureaucracy that characterizes the state. Again, we're also going over Fuk, the political order and political decay as well. And of course, we're talking about tribes and band societies before the formation of a centralized state, or before the formation of the state, which was first done by Japan. In our Japanese history, we're covering in our world history both Japan, China, Vietnam, and other places as well. And of course, we will explore these spectacular sites in order to gain insight into the social life of the pre-state complex societies, okay, societies before the establishment of the state. All right, so first is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a ring of massive standing stones on the Salisbury Plain in England. What was constructed beginning in the early Neolithic, the New Stonehenge, and ending in the early Bronze Age. All right, remember those three characterizations that we discussed earlier. And so the construction of Stonehenge has been variously attributed to the Romans, all right, the Druids, the Danes, and the Greeks. All right, that was by Castellan in 1993. But for some, Stonehenge is the product of mystical forces, or what is called earth mysteries. All right. Archaeological research has demonstrated that Stonehenge is not a single monument, but is rather the site of a sequence of monuments that was built over a period of more than 1,000 years, or 1 millennium. Research on the regions surrounding Stonehenge has documented an entire landscape upon which monuments were constructed. And as a result, Stonehenge can now be grounded within a long process, again, 1 millennium or more of development, and within a broad regional context. And still, the wealth of archaeological research at Stonehenge and in the surrounding region has not dispelled all the enigmas. Understanding the social and economic organization of the people who built Stonehenge still poses significant challenges. And of course, as this text was written, archaeologists have understood primarily that the stones that were brought there were constructed in different sequences. The outer being those put there by the English, and of course those within the middle being by the Scottish. But what has recently been found out in the last year or so is that the middle stones have actually been brought from Ireland. All right. Archaeological research at Stonehenge has demonstrated that the site developed through a series of stages beginning in the late Neolithic period, which is about 5,000 years ago, all right, if we remember that, and ending in the early Bronze Age, all right. So the late Neolithic was 5,000 years ago, all right, about 3,000 BCE, and the early Bronze Age was about 3,500 years ago, which is around 1,500 BCE. Understanding Stonehenge requires an understanding of the long process through which the site came into being. All right, and of course, we have the earthwork circle. This was phase 1. All right, phase 1 was the first monument at Stonehenge. It was a round ditch excavated to enclose an area of 110 meters in the diameter. Slight embankments were built up on both the inside and the outside of the ditch. Wooden posts were erected in a ring of holes known as the Aubrey holes, which they were dug out along the inside of the ditch. Animal bones, including a cow jaw and an ox skull dating to phase 1, were found buried in the ditch. And phase 1 dates to the late Neolithic, roughly 5,000 years ago, as has been previously said. Phase 2, however, would be the burials in a timber structure. All right. During phase 2, the ditch, the earthwork circle, and the Aubrey holes were largely filled in. All right. Human remains dating to phase 2 included remains from cremated burials, and they are found in the fill of both the ditch and some of the Aubrey holes. A structure of standing timber posts was constructed near the center of the monument. And of course, this is phase 2, and it dates to the late Neolithic, between about 5,000 and 4,500 years ago. The recent reappraisal of the site suggests that most of the burials actually date to phase 1. Now, phases of the construction of Stonehenge. All right, phase 1 is the earthwork circle. All right, so just think about the actual stone that surrounds what we think about Stonehenge. We think about the centerpiece, really, is what people normally see. But the earthwork circle is the circle that was formed around the structure before the structure was even built. Then we had in phase 2 burials and a timber structure. All right, we had some burials, we had some timber structures around those earthwork circles, and then of course in phase 3A, and then we have phase 3B. In phase 3A, we have what's called the blue stones. All right, that's when we start to have those stones that normally resemble Stonehenge coming around in a circular formation within the earthwork circle. All right, and then phase 3B, we have what's called the Sarsen circle and the trilithons. All right, the trilithons are circles that or stones that are there at the entrance. All right, before we even get to the earthwork circle, and then of course there are a couple of them within inside the earthwork circle as well before we get to the center of the actual structure of the Stonehenge itself. All right, so the blue stones, I mentioned those in terms of phase 3A, which is a ring of standing stones at the center of Stonehenge. Again, the source of those stones is over 240 kilometers from the actual site itself. Phase 3, we begin the stone monument. The monumental standing stones that are the most impressive aspect of Stonehenge were erected in a series of 6 sub-phases during the early Bronze Age between around 4,500 and 3,500 years ago. Phase 3A, the blue stones, for example, were set up in either a circular or a semicircular formation at the center of the monument, and it was done in a series of holes known as the Q and R holes. The blue stones, which stand between 2 and 2.5 meters high, are not the most impressive stones at the site, but they do raise many questions. The geological source of these stones is not in the vicinity of Stonehenge. It lies in the Preseli Mountains in Wales, over 240 kilometers away in England, modern-day England. Moving these stones from Wales to the Salisbury Plain would have required enormous effort. Some archaeologists have argued that the blue stones had been transported to southern England by glacial activity during the Pleistocene. However, the identification of a bluestone quarry in Wales that was active in the early Bronze Age has provided strong evidence that, in fact, the blue stones were transported by people, and why these particular stones would have had a value to justify such an effort remains an open question. Recent research, however, suggests that the blue stones might have been brought to Stonehenge as early as the first construction phase, perhaps from an earlier monument in Wales to mark a migration. It is an earlier monument in Wales to mark a migration. It is calculated that each stone weighed 2 tons and could have been carried on poles by at least 60 people, with each person bearing a weight of no more than 30 to 50 kilograms. Again, the blue stones are the smaller standing stones in the inner circle, which are surrounded by the far larger Sarsen stones. Okay, so the blue stones would be phase 3A, all right? They're smaller standing stones in the inner circle. And of course, phase 3B would be the Sarsen stones, all right, which are larger. And concerning the Sarsen circle, it was constructed of massive blocks. It was set up in the central area of the site. The blocks were of Sarsen stone, which is, all that to say, a very hard sandstone. It found 30 kilometers from Stonehenge. And in a staggering triumph of engineering, the circle of Sarsen stones was capped by lintels made of solid blocks. These lintels and their supporting stones were fit together with carved joints. Inside the Sarsen circle was another set of Sarsen monoliths known as the trilithons. And these trilithons were arranged in a horseshoe oriented towards the northeast. Of course, the trilithons were set up in 5 pairs, each capped by a lintel. All right, and of course, the trilithons are truly massive, reaching a maximum height of 7 meters each. And then what we have in part of the three phase 3 We've done 3A, which is the blue stones, 3B, which is the sarsen stones and the trilithon stones, and now we have phase 3C through F, which was the rearranging of the blue stones and digging of holes. The construction of the sarsen circle and the trilithons was the most intensive phase, of course, at Stonehenge. There then followed a series of 3 phases in which the blue stones were reorganized and a series of holes was dug in concentric circles around the site. In the final configuration, one set of blue stones was arranged in the shape of a horseshoe on the inside of the trilithons, and another was erected between the trilithons and the sarsen circle. 2 concentric rings of pits were excavated around the outside of the monument. And again, just to recap, that the blue stones is a ring of standing stones at the center of Stonehenge. The source of the stones is over 240 kilometers from Stonehenge. The sarsen circle is a circle of massive upright sandstone blocks, which is capped with lintels set up in the central area of the Stonehenge site. And then to recap, the trilithons are 3 pairs of upright sandstone blocks that are capped with lintels at Stonehenge, which is located within the sarsen circle. Okay, so there's the sarsen circle, all right, the massive circle of upright sandstone blocks, all right, and the trilithons are located within that circle, all right. Stonehenge was not an isolated monument. Numerous different types of earthen mounds and enclosures were built on the Salisbury Plain during the late Neolithic period and the early Bronze Age. One of the most impressive features is the avenue, which is a path bounded by ditches and embankments that runs for over a kilometer between the Avon River and Stonehenge. Although the function of the avenue appears to have been to guide people toward the actual site of Stonehenge, other features on the site have a less clear purpose. The most massive of these is the cursus, a slightly raised earthen platform that runs for almost 3 kilometers in an east-west alignment. The entire landscape of the Salisbury Plain was sculpted by these massive earthen constructions. New excavations at the cursus have shown that this feature might actually predate the first phase of construction at Stonehenge. Concerning the context of Stonehenge, if you take history classes, you'll understand, one of the first things you'll understand is the importance of context. Stone monuments constructed during the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age are found in many parts of Western Europe. However, even within this context, Stonehenge stands out as a marvel of engineering and a true enigma. We might ask, what was its function within the lives of the people who built it? Many have argued that the monument is aligned in order to allow for the prediction of celestial events. But it seems beyond question that it was a construction of religious significance. Almost no domestic remains have been discovered during excavations at the site. Moreover, in the region as a whole, domestic remains are limited to small pits with artifacts and the faint traces of houses built of wooden posts. The people who built Stonehenge were agriculturalists. They raised wheat and grazed cattle. Remember we talked about agriculture on our archaeological section on the origins of agriculture. And again, they raised wheat and grazed cattle. There's botanical evidence that in the late Neolithic, the Salisbury Plain became an increasingly open landscape used mostly for grazing. Recent excavations at the site of Durrington Walls, located 2.8 kilometers from Stonehenge, have revealed the exciting discovery of a series of houses that appear to be part of a village dating to the late Neolithic. However, analysis of plant and animal remains from Durrington Walls suggests that this might not have been a normal village. Evidence for cooking plant food is rare. In the large quantity of animal bones recovered, mostly of pigs, but also some of cattle, there were few neonatal bones. The absence of bones of newborn animals does not fit with expectations if herds were raised on site. And so it appears likely that Durrington Walls was a feasting site, perhaps linked to the early phases of the construction of the monument. Again, Durrington Walls is a site on the Avon River near Stonehenge, in which 3 monumental timber circles and evidence of occupation has been established. Colin Renfrew, again, he's another important archaeologist, and he has argued that Stonehenge was built by people living in chiefdoms, and that the increasing scale of the monument over time reflects the increasing size of territories controlled by a single chief. Renfrew recognized in the late 20th century that a critical weakness in his argument is the absence of what's called, quote, direct evidence among the artifacts found for personal ranking, as indicated by distinctive dress, ornament, or possessions, end quote. However, in the early 21st century, archaeologists working on a rescue excavation before a housing development was to be constructed found a pair of burials that fulfill Renfrew's prediction. The people who built Stonehenge did include elites marked by ornaments and possessions. The Amesbury archer, as the main burial came to be known, was found 3 miles from Stonehenge. Again, the Amesbury archer is a burial with a range of elite burial goods found near Stonehenge, again, 3 miles from it. And he lived during the early Bronze Age, corresponding to Phase 3 in the construction of Stonehenge. A recent program of radiocarbon dating indicates that the Amesbury archer lived during Phase 3C through F after the Sarsen Circle and the Trilithons had been erected. Objects found with the burial include 2 slate wrist guards, a bone pin, 2 copper knives, 5 pots, boar tusks, a cache of flints, arrowheads, and a shale belt ring, and 2 gold earrings. No other burial with a similar wealth of grave goods has ever been found or discovered from this period. Nearby, however, a second burial was found of an individual with more modest grave goods that include gold earrings. Of course, the goods found with these 2 burials are precisely the kind of display items that Renfrew would expect in the burials of the leaders of a chiefdom. However, the Amesbury archer also raises questions. Isotopic analyses of the skeletal remains indicate that the archer grew up not in the vicinity of Stonehenge, but rather far off in the Alps. And so why did he move such a long distance? How did he gain status in a society where he was not born? And of course, the Amesbury archer had a amalgam of grave goods around him. And so, what Stonehenge mean? Well, it might seem that there must be an explanation for Stonehenge, that it is a mystery waiting to be unlocked. Of course, there is no lack of explanations for the monument. They range from the construction of a prehistoric observatory to fantasies of a Druid sanctuary. Certainly, there is some truth behind these ideas. Stonehenge must have had a ritual function, and many aspects of the arrangement of the standing stones correspond to celestial orientations. However, an archaeologist named Barbara Bender has criticized such explanations as attempts to freeze the past that lack a sense of an ongoing historical process. Bender's critique is particularly relevant to the site of Stonehenge, a monument that came into being as part of a process lasting over 1,500 years. And according to Julian Thomas, Stonehenge never had a meaning. Over more than 80 generations, Stonehenge became the landscape within which people lived. The essential explanations of the monument is that it does not have a single explanation. Rather, it must be understood and comprehended as the long-term unfolding of a society's relationship to the landscape. And we can't say anything about what Stonehenge means. Can we? Well, determining the meaning of ancient monuments is very treacherous terrain, since we are essentially trying to gain insight into prehistoric beliefs. Ian Hodder, remember we talked about Ian Hodder as one of the ones who went against the new archaeology, but we can say he has placed Stonehenge within the broader context of monument building in the Neolithic of Western Europe. And Hodder sees the emergence of large monuments as part of the expansion of the households to include a larger group of people spread over a wider area. Stonehenge is, in his view, one of many monuments that recreate the household at the level of a regional landscape. Bender, however, takes a somewhat different approach, seeing the scale of construction at Stonehenge and the surrounding area as producing a fusion of nature and culture. Over the generations, the constructions at Stonehenge became elements of a developing landscape, where the lines between nature and culture were blurred. The bio versus natura. One intriguing idea is that for Stonehenge and the surrounding earthworks, such as the avenue, the act of producing and experiencing the landscape was as important as the enduring monument. Bender points out that the landscape was an important, and that digging and refilling of holes in the way that the earthworks would have channeled people's movements. She also suggests that the shaping of the landscape might have expressed and strengthened conceptions of gender and power in society. Mike Parker Pearson has developed an interpretation of Stonehenge that builds on recent research at the site of Durrington Walls. Like Stonehenge, Durrington Walls sits on the Avon River, but in every other aspect, these sites are extreme opposites. At Durrington Walls, there is evidence of occupation, including houses, while at Stonehenge, there is no domestic debris. And, of course, at Durrington Walls, it has 3 monumental circles, but these, of course, are built of timber rather than standing stones. Radiocarbon dating has now shown that Durrington Walls and Phase 3B at Stonehenge, the period of the construction of the Trilithons and Sarsen Circle, are contemporary. Parker Pearson has suggested a connection between the two sites, saying that Durrington Walls was the land of the living, while Stonehenge was the domain of the dead, the domain of the ancestors. At Stonehenge, the wood circle at Durrington Walls was transformed into stone, a material that represented the builder's ancestors. And if Parker Pearson and his interpretation is correct, it might explain why the builders of the Sarsen Circle used mortise and tenon, as well as tongue and groove joints to fit the lintels into the upright stones. These, of course, are techniques that were used in woodworking, and of course their use at Stonehenge is extremely puzzling. Perhaps the explanation of this feature is symbolic rather than technological. Perhaps Stonehenge was built as a stone replica of a wooden structure. Parker Pearson believes that Stonehenge would have stood empty after its construction, that its inhabitants were the spirits of the ancestors. In our next reading, we'll go over Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon. Again, we want to sum up the evidence, suggesting that archaeological research has demonstrated that Stonehenge came into being over a period of more than 1,500 years. It is therefore very unlikely that the site has a single meaning or an explanation, which means that there could be multiple meanings or multiple explanations, since it has been constructed and worked on for a period of 1,500 years. And the source of power underlying the construction of the site did not rest on control based on force, as it is often found in state societies. And so the Amesbury Archer provides the first direct evidence of the elites of the early Bronze Age society in the region. And although the cultural context of Stonehenge remains enigmatic, the new excavations at Durrington Walls have opened up a promising new line of research on the cultural landscape of Stonehenge. And next we'll talk about Pueblo Bonito, Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon is in New Mexico, and it became the center of a regional settlement network and the site of the construction of large multi-storied structures known as great houses. And this began around 800 CE. And a great house is simply a large multi-storied structure or structures located at Chaco Canyon. Again, Chaco Canyon is in New Mexico, and it became the center of a regional settlement network that began around 800 CE. And our next reading in part 4 of our archaeological series, we will talk about social complexity and complexity without the state. We will talk about the development of Pueblo Bonito, as well as the function of Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. All right, so we have just summed up the evidence for Stonehenge and Durrington Walls. In our next reading, we will discuss Pueblo Benito in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico.